Welcome, if you dare, to this descent into one of the most unsettling and sinister chapters buried deep within the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we unravel the horrors that follow, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment telling us exactly where you are watching from and the precise time you hear these words. Midnight, dawn, alone in your room, or in the company of others? Because every time these accounts are told, it feels less like a story and more like a haunting that stretches across places, hours, and lives, including yours. Now listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to surface from the snow. Imagine it, December 1867, deep in the Missouri Ozarks. A postal carrier rides through the storm, searching for warmth, for fire, for the flicker of life inside a cabin he's passed before. But when he pushes open that door, he finds something else entirely. The air is frozen still. The hearth is dead. A meal sits abandoned on the table, fork mid-bite, as though time itself had snapped shut. The coats of two brothers still hang by the door. Their rifles rest undisturbed above the fireplace. And yet, they are gone, vanished. At first, it seems like a simple disappearance, swallowed by the wilderness. But men who knew these hills would soon discover what should never have been unearthed. A tunnel beneath the cabin, hidden chambers carved into the hillside, shelves lined with trophies, watches, rings, boots, and coats that belonged to travelers who had never come home. And in the smokehouse, among the salted meats, something far more horrifying. Cuts of flesh that no hunter would ever claim. This was not a home. It was a trap. A pit dressed as hospitality. A place where weary strangers laid down their burdens and never rose again. And yet the story runs deeper still, because the Stillwell brothers were not merely killers hiding in the woods. Their very identities were shadows, their pasts erased, their names likely stolen. Men with no history, planting themselves at a crossroads of the frontier where lives could vanish without a trace. Ask yourself, who benefits when horror is written off as mystery? When men disappear, when records vanish, when bodies are buried in shallow pits? You think this was just the work of two mad brothers in a cabin? No. The ledger they left behind proves otherwise. Names, dates, values, tallies, like accounts being settled. And some of those names matched merchants, ministers, and men of influence whose disappearances were never solved. So I ask you, was this really the work of two isolated brothers? Or was it something far darker, a system of erasure hidden beneath the cloak of frontier chaos? Stay with me. By the end of this descent, you won't see history the same way again. The disappearance of the Stillwell brothers was only the surface fracture of a story that cut much deeper into the veins of the Ozarks. And once the sheriff's men began to peel back the frozen soil, the illusion of frontier hospitality began to collapse. Beneath the floorboards of that weathered cabin lay a ledger, not a diary, not a journal, but a book of transactions, names, dates, and values written in a cold hand, as if men's lives were nothing more than entries in an account. Some were marked with a crude X, others with notations like quality goods or timepiece, each detail reducing flesh and soul to a commodity. When the sheriff cross-referenced those names with reports of missing travelers, the ledger turned into a map of erasures. Men who had left home and never returned, swallowed whole not just by murder, but by systematic disappearance. And what unsettled investigators most was that this ledger suggested organization, not madness. It wasn't the scribbling of a deranged recluse. It was bookkeeping, precise, deliberate, detached. What were two backwoods brothers doing with such a system, and why did their trail vanish the moment their cabin was open to scrutiny? That is the question no official record dared to answer. Because the further the county dug, the more the evidence began to suggest that Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell were not simply killers. They were participants in a network of disappearance, feeding a hunger older and wider than one cabin in the hills. Those boots and watches in the hidden chamber did not speak of robbery alone. They spoke of extraction, of selection, of lives stripped down to bone and marrow. And the bones themselves bore marks of precision, as though studied, as though processed not only for sustenance, but for knowledge. Ask yourself, who in 1867 Missouri had the resources to vanish without a past, to pay for land and gold we wars. And the nation's currency was broken, and to maintain their cover until the day a storm peeled it back. The brothers were not alone. They were functionaries in a darker design, one meant to remain invisible, one meant to feed something far greater than hunger. When Sheriff Harrington ordered his men to expand the search beyond the cabin walls, they unearthed something far more sinister than abandoned coats and ledger books, something that even hardened frontier lawmen struggled to put into words. In the smokehouse, strung up among cuts of preserved meat, were pieces that no man of conscience could mistake. The county physician, Dr. William Hayes, wrote only one sentence in his report. Certain preserved meats appear to be of human derivation. He could not bring himself to elaborate. Think about that. Travelers weary from the road, strangers offering a coin for stew, and the Stillwell brothers ladling into their bowls the flesh of those who had come before them. Hospitality turned into desecration, survival into ritual. The bones found in shallow graves nearby showed signs of deliberate breaking, marrow extracted, the marks of blades cutting with anatomical knowledge rather than crude savagery. This was not desperation. It was practice, discipline, a refinement of butchery that blurred the line between sustenance and sacrament. And yet the most disturbing truth was not what the lawmen found, but what they failed to find. Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell were gone, their meal abandoned mid-bite, as though they had been summoned away or erased before the veil of secrecy could collapse entirely. Was it chance that the snowstorm forced Thomas Weston into that cabin on that exact day, or was the storm itself cover for a hand that moved quietly behind the scene? Because when men vanish without a trace, when killers dissolve into the mist with no records, no families, no histories, someone benefits, someone higher, someone watching. The story, we are told, is of two backwoods brothers gone rogue, of cannibals lurking in the wilderness, but the evidence reads differently. The ledger entries stretch back to 1863, the year the Stillwells appeared from nowhere, as if placed at the exact moment the Civil War fractured Missouri into chaos. That chaos was cover, a smokescreen under which disappearances could be dismissed, travelers forgotten, records misplaced. What looks like random cruelty begins to resemble method, and what looks like hospitality gone wrong begins to look like recruitment, collection, procurement. The Stillwell brothers were not improvising. They were fulfilling a role, and when the mask slipped, they were extracted before they could be questioned. What you are hearing now is not folklore. It is a glimpse into the machinery of disappearance that history has buried under the word unsolved. The winter of 1867 hardened around that cabin like a coffin, but the echoes of what was uncovered there would not be silenced. Newspapers tried to reduce it to lurid copy, foul play suspected, as if the reality could be contained in ink. But locals knew better. They whispered that the Stillwell land itself felt poisoned, that even the snow lay differently there, as though it covered a wound rather than a landscape. The sheriff's men dug pits, overturned soil, and pried into walls, but the brothers' trail was gone, their absence more unsettling than any presence could have been. Elias and Jeremiah had not been caught in a storm, nor had they fled like guilty men in panic. The details betrayed a different truth. Their rifles hung ready, their coats waiting by the door, food half-eaten, signs of an interruption swift and absolute. And what of Theodore Palmer's testimony, claiming he had seen Jeremiah riding north with provisions only a day before? If Jeremiah left of his own accord, then who or what called Elias from his seat at that table? This contradiction hangs like a noose in the record. It suggests coordination, timing, orchestration, something moving behind the curtain of official history. And here lies the darker implication. When men like the Stillwells are removed, it is not because they are too evil, but because they are no longer useful. Systems erase their own instruments once exposure becomes risk. The ledger, the graves, the meat in the smokehouse, these were never supposed to surface. Ask yourself, how did that ledger survive at all? Pages torn out, names missing, but still enough left to confirm the pattern. It's almost as if someone wanted a trace to remain, a shadow of the truth without its source, like bait for the mind that dares to look closer. And yet, every attempt to chase the Stillwells' origins led to silence. Kentucky yielded no records, no famils, no graves of parents or childhood homes. It was as if they had been conjured into being, walking out of the war like specters wearing borrowed names. But nothing is born from nothing. They came from somewhere, someone placed them here, and the proof of that lies in the currency of their first transaction. Gold coins, heavy and unquestioned at a time when the nation was bleeding paper money. Where does gold come from in the middle of war-torn Missouri? Who funds the nameless? Follow that trail, and you stop asking if the brothers were monsters and begin asking who their masters were. The deeper you trace their origins, the clearer the silence becomes. Men in the 1860s did not appear out of nowhere. Every farmer, every trapper, every soldier carried a past, a family name tied to land or lineage. But with Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell, there was nothing. No baptismal records, no census entries, no mention in Kentucky or any of the surrounding states. Nothing before 1863, when they stepped into Webster County carrying gold, tools, and silence. And here is the first fracture in the official narrative. Because in the aftermath of Civil War, paper currency ruled, Confederate notes burned worthless, Union greenbacks unsteady, and coinage was hoarded like blood. Yet the brothers paid in gold, not once, not twice, but consistently. Gold does not flow from poor drifters. It flows from supply chains, from hidden hands, from vaults deep enough to outlast nations. Ask yourself, who profits when killers set up shop along a lonely road? Who seeds them with wealth, gives them cover identities, and positions them where travelers vanish unnoticed? The ledger was not merely a tally of theft. It was an accounting system, precise enough to track, cryptic enough to conceal meaning from the untrained eye. And its existence proves one thing: the Stillwell brothers were not improvising. They were reporting. Every X, every note of quality goods was not a private reflection, but a message, entries left for someone else to interpret. That ledger, hidden beneath the bed, was not a diary of sins, but a balance sheet, waiting for collection. And when too many entries began to match missing men of substance, merchants, preachers, men whose absence could not be explained away, removal became necessary. Not their removal of others, but their own erasure. Look closely at the timing. The last ledger entry made November 29, 1867, and within 2 weeks, their cabin is discovered abandoned. Their food left untouched, their rifles undisturbed. That is not coincidence. That is a cut-off date. The Stillwells had finished their usefulness. Their role was completed, their ledger delivered, their silence enforced. And so they disappeared not like hunted men, but like tools reclaimed by the very system that placed them. This is how networks operate. When the mask of individual crime grows too thin, when public eyes wander too close, the mask is burned, the actors vanish, and the audience is left only with mystery. Mystery is safer than truth, because mystery makes men shrug and walk away. But truth, the truth is that the Stillwell brothers were not the beginning of the horror. They were a fragment of something older, a machinery of disappearance and control that used blood and bone as its currency. Missouri in 1867 was not simply a state recovering from war. It was a battlefield that never ended, a borderland riddled with scars, divided loyalties, and men who slipped into shadows because shadows were safer than truth. The Civil War had left Missouri fractured, not just politically, but spiritually. Guerrilla fighters had turned roads into killing grounds. Law had dissolved into revenge, and whole communities had been erased in the crossfire. In such chaos, disappearances were not anomalies, they were expected. A merchant who vanished on the road? Blame the bushwhackers. A preacher who never reached his flock? Blame deserters or desperate thieves. A family that failed to return from Springfield? Blame the wilderness itself. The Ozarks became a graveyard of excuses, and into that graveyard walked the Stillwell brothers, their cabin perfectly placed on a road where missing lives could dissolve into the fog of war's aftermath. It was the perfect camouflage, and you must understand, camouflage is never accidental. Power does not waste chaos, it harvests it. And so, as neighbors rebuilt barns and tried to stitch their lives back together, Elias and Jeremiah were playing a different role, one sanctioned by the very disorder that concealed them. Think of the ledger again, stretching from 1863 to 1867. That span is no accident. It begins the year the brothers appear, the very year Missouri became a theater of irregular war, and it ends when the fog begins to clear, when order attempts to reassert itself. The Stillwells did not choose those years, they were chosen by them. This is why the official record struggles to explain their origins, their funding, their vanishing. Because to admit the truth would be to admit that in the heart of Missouri, someone was turning chaos into currency, transforming war's aftermath into a hunting ground. And if two nameless brothers could be being aced in Webster County with gold and a mandate, how many others were scattered across this fractured nation, men without pasts, inserted into borderlands, into lonely crossroads, into towns where graves outnumbered laws? Once you see this, the Stillwells cease to be an anomaly. They become a glimpse, a fracture, a thin tear in the curtain of how power operates when no one is watching. War is not just fought with bullets, it is fought with silence, with disappearance, with the careful removal of those who will not be missed until it is too late. And in Missouri's Ozarks, that silence became flesh, cooked and served to the unsuspecting, hospitality masking a deeper hunger, the hunger of a system that feeds not on food, but on the erasure of men. Sheriff James Harrington was no fool, though the official reports reduce him to a man dutifully cataloging horrors. Between the lines of his testimony, you can feel it. That weight, that sense that what he uncovered at the Stillwell cabin did not belong to Webster County alone. The graves, the smokehouse, the ledger, these were enough to hang any man, and yet the killers themselves slipped into nothingness. That contradiction gnawed at him. In his notes, he described the silence inside the cabin as unnatural, as though absence itself were staged. And when he catalogued the evidence, he did not write like a lawman tallying crimes. He wrote like a man trying to make sense of an order he did not recognize, a pattern too deliberate to dismiss. Remember this: Harrington had fought in the war, seen men butchered in the field, and yet he hesitated to put words to the marks found on those bones. Not just cut, not just stripped, but processed. He knew the difference between desperation and method. These were not starving men, these were men following procedure. And when he tried to follow the trail outward, when he sent inquiries to Kentucky, when he pressed other counties for records, he was met with silence. No origins, no matches, no history. It was as if the Stillwells' lives before Webster County had been erased with surgical precision, the same way their victims had been. Do you understand the implication? The sheriff had stumbled not just upon murder, but upon the edges of a design too large to speak openly. His own report admits pages missing from the ledger, torn clean, as though someone had already removed the most dangerous names. Who removed them? Not the brothers. They vanished without their coats, without their rifles, without the time to tidy up. Someone else. someone who had access to the cabin before the law arrived, someone who ensured that what remained would be enough to terrify the public, but not enough to expose the system. That is how control works. It gives you fragments, enough to believe you've seen horror, while hiding the architecture that makes horror useful. Sheriff Harrington stood at that edge, peered into it, and the record shows what happens next. The investigation slowed, the urgency cooled, the trail went cold. Not because the sheriff lacked courage, but because the machinery of silence moved faster than any one man could fight. And that silence, the deliberate, engineered silence, is the loudest proof that the Stillwells were not acting alone. The newspapers wasted no time, for horror sells faster than wheat. Within weeks, presses in St. Louis, Springfield, even as far as Chicago, carried tales of the Butcher brothers of Webster County. Yet if you read them closely, the stories feel curated. Violent, yes, but strangely contained. The papers fixated on lurid details, bones in the smokehouse, bodies in shallow graves, the taste of human flesh whispered in farmhouses across the Ozarks. But what they did not publish is even louder. No mention of the ledger, no mention of the gold coins used in transactions, no mention of the sheriff's unease at the systematic nature of the killings. Instead, the public was given a simple, digestible story. Two backwoods brutes, driven by madness or hunger, turned to murder and cannibalism, then vanished like animals into the trees. The Stillwells were made into a folk tale before the blood in their cabin had dried. This was not incompetence, it was choreography. By reducing them to monsters, the papers erased the question of design. Madness requires no funding, no hidden hand, no ledger of names and goods. Madness absolves society of complicity. And so the public accepted the tale, shuddered, and moved on, comforted by the belief that evil is rare, isolated, born of derangement rather than intention. But buried within the archives, small county circulars, personal letters, scraps that survived fire and mildew, you find what the papers did not want printed. A farmer's wife wrote that federal agents came through the county before the sheriff even filed his final report. A Springfield editor privately admitted that the ledger business was too sensitive for publication, though he would not say why. A single line in the St. Louis Republican slips through, almost unnoticed. It is feared the men were not acting without influence. Then silence. The thread was cut. This is how the machinery operates. It feeds the masses a story grotesque enough to satisfy, while diverting eyes from the parts that matter. Ask yourself, if the Stillwells were nothing but feral killers, why did the record of their origins vanish from 3 states? Why did officials outside Webster County take interest in a crime scene that should have been mere local tragedy? Why were parts of the ledger deliberately excised, leaving only the suggestion of accounting, but not the names that might have revealed who was paying? The answer is simple and terrible. Because the Stillwells were not the story. They were the mask. The real story, the one erased, was about who wore that mask, and how many other masks walked the borderlands of a broken nation. The Stillwell horror, if left as an isolated tale, would already be enough to chill the blood. But isolation is a lie, one carefully woven to keep connections from being drawn. Because when you begin to place the Stillwells beside other vanishings of that same decade, the pattern sharpens into focus. In Arkansas, 1865, a stagecoach disappeared with all 6 passengers, the wreck later found intact, luggage rifled, yet coins and jewelry left untouched. In Kansas, 1866, a family of 4 traveling west was discovered dead in their wagon, their bodies mutilated but nothing stolen. An investigation closed with the official line of Indian attack, though the wounds did not match arrows or tomahawks, but knives with surgical precision. In Illinois, 1868, a string of missing itinerant preachers left whispers of devil worshippers in the backwoods, though one report quietly noted a burned ledger recovered from an abandoned cabin near the Wabash River. These are not coincidences, they are echoes. The Stillwells were not the disease, they were a symptom. Each case carries the same fingerprints: sudden appearance of unknown men or families with no history, commerce paid in gold when others had only paper, disappearances explained away by convenient fears, Indians, bandits, madness, wilderness. Always the same narrative, always the same erasures, and yet always a trace left behind, like a whisper meant for the ones who would look deeper. You see, systems of control thrive not by eliminating all evidence, but by leaving just enough to twist into folklore. Folklore neutralizes inquiry. It turns horror into story, story into warning, warning into silence. What better camouflage than myth? And so the Stillwells became cannibals. The Arkansas stage a ghost coach, the Illinois vanishings the work of witches. Convenient masks, each one, but beneath them is something colder, something organized, something that uses myth as its shroud. If these echoes stretch across the map, then ask yourself, how many others were placed where roads met wilderness, where records thinned, where war's ashes still smoldered? How many nameless families were funded with gold, set down like seeds in soil fertile with chaos? How many cabins, how many ledgers, how many graves were never found? The Stillwells were not an anomaly. They were part of a network, and networks have architects. The official record is thin, but private words never meant for print carry more weight than columns of newsprint ever dared. Letters, journals, scraps of testimony spoken in kitchens and scribbled in margins. These reveal that people who lived in the shadow of the Stillwells, and in the shadow of cases like theirs, sensed something larger than madness at work. A widow in Howell County wrote to her sister in 1869, "The men are gone from Webster, but I fear the road is not rid of them, for the riders are still watched, and sometimes we hear whistling in the trees, though no man stands there." In a diary from Benton County, a circuit rider records, "2 men, claiming to be brothers, tall and gray-eyed, paid me in coin that bore no mint I knew. They would not give their town of origin, and when I pressed, they asked me if I liked my work, and if my road was safe." Even Sheriff Harrington, whose notes have mostly rotted with age, left one line still legible in the corner of a page. "The house was only the surface. Someone keeps watch from the higher hills." Do you see the implication? Those closest to the events felt the shape of something orchestrated. They could not name it, but they knew. And scattered across Missouri and beyond, you find parallel traces. Rumors of strangers who arrive fully grown, funded, unspeaking of the past. Travelers who vanish without theft as motive. Ledgers hidden and burned, and always gold at the center, heavy and untraceable, as though poured into circulation from a vault not tied to any bank of man. These fragments may seem like paranoia, but paranoia is simply the language of those who sense truth without proof. And here lies the dreadful consistency. In every case, the stories trail off into silence. The witnesses die, the letters end, the trails grow cold. It is almost as if the act of noticing draws the curtain tighter, as if the network, self-adjusts, excises, erases. The Stillwells were not undone because of their crimes. They were undone because someone noticed too much, because the ledger spoke too loudly, because the sheriff's spade hit ground that was meant to remain undisturbed. And so, as the 1870s dawned, the case was already fading into folklore, muted whispers of cannibals in the hills, while the true architecture, the hidden design, dissolved back into shadow. That is how it survives. Not by eliminating every story, but by letting just enough survive to distract from what lies behind it. By the 1870s, the Stillwell case had already begun its metamorphosis from crime into legend, and this transformation was no accident. Communities do not carry raw horror forward unchanged. They bend it, soften its edges with story, reframe it so it can be told without breaking the teller. But folklore is not simply forgetting, it is a method of burial. In Webster County, children were warned, "Don't stray the Stillwell Road, or the brothers will have you for supper." Songs were hummed in farmhouses about the cabin with smoke that smelled too sweet. Preachers turned the tale into sermons, declaring the brothers punished by God for cannibalism. Each retelling stripped away the inconvenient details, the ledger, the gold, the vanishing without trace, and replaced them with simpler terrors: hunger, madness, evil born of sin. The story was domesticated, made safe for fireside repetition. And yet, within that safety, the truth was smuggled forward in fragments. Some versions whispered that the Stillwells were not alone, but placed by a devil who moved men like pieces on a board. Others claimed the brothers could not die, that they still walked the ridges, funded by coin that came from no earthly mine. You see, folklore does not erase, it encodes. It carries what cannot be spoken in plain words, preserving suspicion in the shape of monsters. But who benefits from this? Those who planted the Stillwells in the first place, because as long as the public believed in bogeymen in the woods, they did not ask about ledgers and networks. They feared phantoms, not systems. And folklore ensured the fear stayed localized, a ghost story tied to one county, one cabin, one pair of brothers. The greater machinery, the pattern across states, the funding in gold, the deliberate erasures, was safely hidden behind laughter and shudders. It is here, in the transformation of history into myth, that Mont now glimpse the real genius of control. Horror left bare provokes rebellion. Horror disguised as story provokes silence. And so by the time the grandchildren of those who found the Stillwell cabin came of age, the brothers were no longer evidence, they were entertainment, a warning, a song. The ledger was forgotten, but the shadows behind it remained. The system had buried its crime in the mouths of children. By the late 19th century, the Stillwell name had already dissolved into smoke, carried only in half-remembered warnings and campfire songs. Yet, as the 1880s crept in, new cases emerged that felt less like fresh horrors and more like repetitions, variations of the same dark hymn. In Tennessee, 1883, children vanished from a church-run orphanage, their absence explained away by fire, though no charred remains were found. In Oklahoma Territory, 1886, a wagon train disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a broken wheel and a burned campfire still smoldering. And in Tennessee again, 1888, the whispers grew of another orphanage, where records did not match mouths fed, where boys went missing and no inquiries followed. In each case, the pattern repeats: sudden institutions or families appearing with no traceable origin, payments made in gold coin long after paper currency had become common, erasures in official records so clean it seemed less like oversight than deliberate excision. The Stillwells may have vanished from Webster County, but their echo re-emerged, transplanted into new soil. These were not coincidences. They were continuity. What Missouri revealed in 1867 was not a single crime, but a glimpse into a network that adapted, relocated, evolved. When the heat grew too sharp in one place, the mask was burned and remade elsewhere. And always, the same signs followed: a ledger, half kept, half burned, disappearances explained with convenient folklore, silence from authorities more telling than words. The Stillwells were only the beginning of the story the public glimpsed, and even that glimpse was distorted into myth. Behind them moved the same invisible architects, testing new disguises: orphans instead of travelers, institutions instead of cabins, haunted houses instead of smokehouses. The horror had not ended. It had professionalized. And by the time the century turned, anyone trying to stitch the patterns together found themselves dismissed as cranks, dreamers, or storytellers. But the fragments persist, scattered like teeth in the soil. Missouri, Arkansas, Illinois, Tennessee. a chain of disappearances spanning decades, linked not by names but by method, by coin, by silence. The Stillwell brothers were not the story's end. They were its prologue. By the 1890s, the Stillwell horror had rotted into legend, its facts half buried under snowdrifts of superstition. In Missouri, locals stopped speaking the brothers' names directly, muttering instead about the place where travelers vanish. In Tennessee, whispers of orphanages where boys vanished at night began to take root, folded into ghost stories told to frighten children into obedience. But what the public dismissed as folklore was, in truth, the perfect camouflage. The machinery of disappearance thrived beneath the veil of haunted tales. Newspapers, increasingly controlled by political and financial elites, learned to feed the hunger for lurid ghost stories while scrubbing out details that hinted at systematic operations. When entire groups of children disappeared in 1894 from an Ozark orphanage, the official narrative spoke of fire, faulty lamps, and tragic accident. But the record showed inconsistencies. The number of orphans enrolled exceeded the number ever buried, and donations from wealthy sponsors spiked curiously in the months before the disaster. The language of horror became institutional. Fires, epidemics, sudden relocations, and the people learned to shrug, conditioned to accept tragedies as part of life in hard times. Yet the pattern was no accident. The Stillwell method had matured. Hospitality became philanthropy. Cabins became brick orphanages. A bowl of stew became government-funded bread lines. The camouflage grew bolder. Now the very institutions meant to nurture were feeding on those they claimed to protect. The trick was no longer secrecy, but normalization, embedding disappearance into the natural order of things so thoroughly that no one thought to ask why the same patterns kept repeating. If you've ever wondered why tales of haunted orphanages are so common in America's folklore, it is because they are fragments of this deeper pattern, rituals of erasure retold as children's ghost stories. The brothers in the Ozarks were simply the most obvious masks to slip. What came after was far more sophisticated, and yet, when you peel back the veil, you see it clearly. The same ledger hidden in different forms, always counting, always measuring, always profiting from human absence. The world tells you these are myths. I tell you they are history. As the century turned, the hunger adapted. The frontier cabin gave way to brick institutions, and the rough ledger of Elias Stillwell evolved into official registries stamped with state seals. By 1900, America was reshaping itself, industrializing, centralizing, modernizing. Yet beneath this progress, the same shadows lengthened. State-run orphanages multiplied after the Civil War, ostensibly to care for abandoned children, but their records bled with inconsistencies. Hundreds admitted, far fewer discharged, and burial plots that did not match the numbers. Prisons swelled with men whose sentences seemed engineered less by justice and more by quotas, commodities for the new labor markets. Asylums overflowed with the inconvenient, widows, dissenters, veterans scarred by battle. The public was told these were charitable institutions, safe havens for the unwanted. But look closely, and the pattern reveals itself. Inmates vanished from registries, transferred elsewhere, their identities swallowed in paperwork so dense no family could ever find them. Orphans simply disappeared, adopted with no trace, as though the ground itself had claimed them. The Stillwells had hidden their victims in cellars, wells, and smokehouses. These new institutions buried theirs in bureaucracy, paper graves as effective as soil. By then, the legends of haunted orphanages were spreading, serving as convenient distractions. People laughed nervously at stories of children's laughter echoing through abandoned halls, never realizing those tales masked real vanishings. The elites understood something primal. If you give people a ghost to chase, they'll stop looking for the living who went missing. That is the cruel genius of institutional horror. It makes the unspeakable unspeakable, not by hiding it, but by parodying it until it seems unbelievable. And if you believe this shift was accidental, think again. It was engineered. These systems fed the same appetite that once lurked in a Missouri cabin, but now cloaked in authority, permanence, and legitimacy. The ledger had gone national. The cellars had become states, and the public had been trained to applaud their own captors, mistaking their cages for care. What the Stillwells began in 1867 as an experiment in quiet predation became, by 1900, the very skeleton of modern control. Institutions that consume without being questioned, and vanishing so common they are mistaken for coincidence. By the early 20th century, the pattern had matured into something colder, more deliberate, more systemic. Institutions no longer merely concealed disappearances, they engineered them as part of their design. Funding streams appeared with strange origins, private donations and gold coins, long after the nation had abandoned them, endowments whose benefactors left no living heirs, and government appropriations signed off without scrutiny. Money flowed like blood, feeding orphanages, prisons, asylums, and hospitals that seemed always hungry, always expanding, always demanding more bodies to justify their existence. And then came the science of control, the dawn of psychology. No longer did men vanish only into cellars and smokehouses, they vanished into diagnoses, categories, numbers. A child labeled unfit or incorrigible could be stripped from his family and institutionalized without recourse. A soldier returning from war with too much knowledge could be confined for nervous exhaustion. The public was taught to nod in approval, to see order in what was actually disappearance. The Stillwells used stew and a welcoming smile. Their inheritors used white coats and pens. It was all theater, rituals of legitimacy performed for the masses, while behind the curtain, the same ledger was kept. Only now, the ledger was called census data, admission records, parole rolls, paper walls thicker than stone. But understand this: the ghosts were real. The haunted orphanage stories, the rumors of screams from asylums, the tales of prisoners marched into tunnels never to return, these were not inventions. They were fragments of memory the system could not fully erase. Every time a boy whispered about children vanishing from his dormitory, every time a farmer swore he heard cries under the floorboards of the county asylum, every time a guard admitted there were wings of the prison where no one he was supposed to go, that was the truth bleeding through the myth. The genius of this machine was that it convinced the people to dismiss those fragments as superstition. Ghosts, they said. Legends, they said. And so the silence deepened. The paper walls thickened and the ledger grew. By 1910, the pattern was perfected. The disappearances were no longer crimes to be hidden. They were procedures, bureaucratic rituals, parts of the operating system of a new century. The Stillwell cabin was gone, but its spirit had become America's institutions. And the men who pulled the strings no longer needed to dirty their hands with blood. They had mastered something far more terrifying: disappearance by consent. The 1910s and 1920s marked the next stage in this machinery's evolution, when disappearance became globalized under the cloak of war and progress. The First World War erupted in 1914, and with it came a new opportunity: entire generations of men vanishing into trenches, prisons, camps, and hospitals. Death, trauma, and displacement gave cover for the system to refine itself. Families were told their sons had died overseas, though no bodies returned. Soldiers were reported missing in action, their names etched onto monuments, yet their possessions, watches, rings, letters, turned up later in institutional archives, unclaimed. The war gave legitimacy to vanishing. It normalized the idea that millions could be swallowed and never accounted for. But when the war ended, the machinery did not sleep. It redirected. Veterans who returned broken, too haunted by what they'd seen, were funneled into asylums or drugged into silence. Those who asked too many questions about missing comrades were branded unstable. Disappearance became medical, patriotic, inevitable. And then came propaganda, the perfect tool of psychological conditioning. Newspapers and radio celebrated progress, the roaring age of machines, the march of democracy. Behind those bright headlines lay the quieter statistics. Institutional populations doubling, orphanages bursting, prisons expanding at unprecedented rates. It was no accident. Fear was being weaponized, sculpted into obedience. The public was taught to distrust their own memory, to laugh at old stories of haunted orphanages and murderous brothers in cabins. Instead, they were given a new myth, the myth of benevolent institutions, of safety through control. But look deeper, and you see the ledger hidden within the war's rubble. The same currency, the same secrecy, the same institutional hunger now cloaked as patriotism. The Ozarks cabin was gone, yet at sea. Pirate lingered in every hospital basement, every asylum wing locked to visitors, every temporary holding camp that never released its occupants. What began with the Stillwell's cellar had grown into a network of nations, a web of disappearances shielded by flags and anthems. War had shown the architects something priceless, that entire populations could be made to accept vanishing as natural, inevitable, even honorable. And once people believed that, the machinery no longer needed to hide in the woods of Missouri. It could stand in plain sight, wearing the mask of progress. The 1930s and 1940s were when the mask finally slipped and the machinery of disappearance revealed its full appetite, no longer content with quiet vanishings, but industrializing them on a scale the Stillwell brothers could never have imagined. The Great Depression struck first, and with it came hunger, migration, and desperation, conditions that made the vulnerable easier to harvest. Millions of men roamed in search of work, nameless, rootless, unaccounted for. Some made it into government camps, others simply vanished along the rails, their absence explained away as poverty's price. Then came the rise of authoritarian regimes across the globe, and the machinery sharpened itself into something mechanical, efficient, merciless. Work camps, prison colonies, and secret facilities became the new smokehouses, only now the scale was industrial. Disappearance was no longer a scandal to be hidden. It was a policy, a mechanism of governance. And yet, even in the United States, where the myth of freedom was sold most loudly, the pattern persisted. Orphanages swelled with children displaced by poverty, many never to emerge. Asylums filled with the unemployed, the disabled, the inconvenient. Entire populations of immigrants were absorbed into holding centers that left no records of discharge. The war years only amplified it. Under the flag of patriotism, men and women vanished into camps, prisons, laboratories. Families were told they had been relocated, reassigned, transferred. But in reality, the ledger was simply being updated with new categories, and through it all, the same signatures appeared. Donations in gold that bypassed conventional currency, paper trails scrubbed of origin, institutional leaders whose pasts were conveniently untraceable. If you look closely at the photographs of that era, the old patterns bleed through. Children staring blankly from orphanage yard, their faces half erased by the camera's exposure. Prisoners laboring in camps, their names reduced to numbers. Families standing outside barbed wire fences, told their loved ones were being cared for. The public believed it because they had been trained to. Horror had been normalized, bureaucratized, wrapped in patriotism and necessity. But behind it, the same ledger was being kept, names, values, notations, X marks. What began in the Missouri woods had grown into a global engine of vanishing, an industry of absence so large it could hide itself in plain sight. The brothers' cellar was gone, but their inheritance had become the century's defining shadow. The aftermath of World War II did not end the machinery, it perfected it. For the first time in history, governments had both the technology and the justification to turn disappearance into a science. Intelligence agencies sprouted like fungi in the dark, each claiming to protect the nation while secretly expanding the art of erasure. Files were burned, rewritten, or sealed for 50 years at a time, ensuring that by the time the truth emerged, the witnesses were already dust. Disappearance became layered, not just physical, but psychological. Men were no longer only taken from their homes or institutions. Their very memories were targeted, rewritten, or discredited. The weapon was no longer just a gun or a cellar. It was the human mind. Projects whispered about today, MKUltra, Paperclip, Artichoke, were not mere experiments. They were the institutional descendants of the Stilwell Ledger. Subjects were selected the same way travelers once were chosen along the Ozark Trail: isolated, unseen, expendable. Prisoners, orphans, mental patients, people who would not be missed, or whose cries could be drowned out by bureaucracy. Their bodies did not always vanish, but their identities did. Erased, reshaped, reprogrammed. And the public was trained to see this as progress, as science, as national security. Newspapers printed stories about breakthroughs in psychology, never mentioning the broken men and women discarded in hospital basements. Universities accepted grants for behavioral studies, never asking where the subjects came from or why they disappeared afterward. The Stilwell's crude notations of value, gold watch, silver cross, fine coat, had evolved into coded files, subject numbers, psychological profiles. The ledger was no longer hidden under a floorboard. It sat in filing cabinets inside government offices, guarded by men in suits instead of rifles. And the haunted orphan, age legends. They spread faster than ever, now cemented into popular culture, ghost stories for campfires, horror novels for cheap thrills. The public fed on the myth, unaware that the myth itself was a smokescreen, keeping them from seeing the real haunted buildings, the laboratories, the clinics, the agencies where vanishing was engineered as policy. What the Stilwell brothers had stumbled into with knives and stew pots had become the architecture of a new empire, an empire of silence, where vanishing was no longer a crime but a tool, a strategy, a science. And the most terrifying part? By mid-century, the machinery had advanced so far that disappearance no longer required chains, cellars, or even bodies. All it needed was belief. The Cold War years carried the machinery into its grandest stage yet. Disappearance on a societal scale where not just individuals but entire populations could be silenced under the veil of ideology. The world was divided into camps, east and west, each feeding on fear of the other. And in that fear, the architects of vanishing found limitless opportunity. In the east, gulags swallowed millions, whole villages uprooted overnight, their names erased from maps, their graves unmarked beneath frozen ground. In the West, the process was subtler, veiled in the language of democracy and security. Black sites, rendition programs, secret airfields. Men disappeared between borders, without trial, without record. The ledger kept now not in barns or cabinets, but in the coded language of classified reports. Newspapers reported defections, espionage trials, ideological struggles, but they did not print the names of those who never resurfaced. The public, conditioned by decades of fear, accepted these vanishings as collateral damage in a necessary struggle. And then came the proxy wars: Korea, Vietnam, Central America, Africa. Lands where disappearance metastasized into policy, where whole villages vanished under the pretense of pacification, where camps and compounds rose like mushrooms in the jungle, hidden from journalists and satellites. Each side accused the other of barbarity, yet both kept ledgers that looked hauntingly similar: numbers, names, classifications, values. The language of the Stilwells, good boots, strong back, worthless woman, had become bureaucratic jargon: useful asset, high risk, expendable. The ghosts multiplied, yet the world was taught to call them something else: refugees, casualties, deserters, traitors. And within this global shadow play, intelligence agencies refined the psychological machinery. Fear itself became the cage. Citizens learned not to ask where. Either neighbors had gone, not to question when files were sealed, not to pry when a name simply ceased appearing in public life. The greatest trick of the Cold War was not nuclear brinkmanship. It was teaching the masses to live beside vanishing and call it normal. The haunted orphanages and cellar legends seemed childish compared to the reality. Entire nations haunted by absences, millions missing from history, whole generations raised in the shadow of silence. The Stilwell brothers had wielded knives in the dark. Their heirs wielded ideology, bureaucracy, and fear on a scale so vast that it erased not just people, but the memory of their existence. By the 1970s and 1980s, the machinery of disappearance had shifted yet again, becoming less about the physical erasure of bodies and more about the erasure of truth itself. Technology, once promised as a liberating force, was bent into the service of concealment. Surveillance systems expanded, first cameras on street corners, then satellites in orbit, then the invisible wires of global communication networks. Every recorded image, every intercepted call, every classified file was another way to edit reality, to decide what was seen and what was forgotten. Disappearance no longer required a vanishing at all. It required only a manipulation of perception. A protest crushed in one city could be erased by simply never reporting it. A prisoner executed in a basement became a transfer on paper. A whole community poisoned by chemical runoff was marked as relocated for safety. The world was taught to consume narratives, not facts, and those narratives were curated by the same institutions that had long fed on vanishing. And yet beneath this new layer of information control, the old rituals remained. Orphans were still funneled into institutions whose records mysteriously ended in the early teens. Political prisoners still vanished into cells whose doors bore no numbers. Indigenous children were taken from their families and placed in schools that taught forgetting as a curriculum, their identities erased with the same bureaucratic precision once used to erase prisoners' names in ledgers. Meanwhile, the culture itself became a weapon. Horror films, urban legends, pulp novels, all recycled the tropes of haunted houses, cursed orphanages, and vanishing travelers. These stories were dismissed as entertainment, yet they worked like camouflage, distracting the public from the living machinery still operating in the shadows. And here lies the strangest irony. The haunted orphanage. It was no longer a legend. It was a metaphor written across society itself. Every institution became a haunted house, every government a keeper of vanished names, every screen a window that could show only what was permitted. In the 1980s, the ledger had become digital, cold, efficient, unfeeling. A missing person's name was now a line of code, a checkbox, a file deleted. No knives, no stew pots, no bloodied ledgers hidden in cabins. The disappearance was seamless, invisible, instantaneous, and the most terrifying part was that the public preferred it that way. They wanted to believe in ghosts and urban legends because the truth that the machinery had never stopped, only evolved, was unbearable. The Stilwell spirit had entered the circuitry of the modern world, and once inside, it could no longer be exorcised. The 1990s and 2000s marked the most insidious evolution yet. Globalization and the rise of the Internet transformed disappearance into something instantaneous, borderless, and nearly impossible to trace. Where the Stilwell brothers once needed a cellar or a smokehouse to hide their victims, now bodies and identities could vanish in plain sight. Digital erasure became the new ledger. Social media accounts deleted, records purged, search results manipulated, memories of individuals rewritten by algorithmic curation. Entire communities could be made to forget events that had actually occurred, replaced with sanitized narratives, fake images, and disinformation. Governments, corporations, and shadow networks learned to work together, each disappearance an exercise in layered denial. First the physical, then the digital, than the collective memory itself. And yet, the machinery was not limited to the abstract. Orphanages, prisons, foster programs, and psychiatric institutions still funneled children, patients, and vulnerable adults into systems that quietly erased them from public life. Missing person databases, once public and fragmented, became opaque and inaccessible, shielded behind bureaucracy and encryption. Citizens learned to accept this as normal, a glitch in the system, a missing link, a bureaucratic error. Meanwhile, the stories of haunted orphanages, strange disappearances along country roads, and inexplicable vanishings were recycled endlessly in movies, books, and forums, told as fiction, yet rooted in real methodology. Fear remained the control tool. People laughed at legends and ghost stories while unknowingly participating in the very culture that enabled mass disappearance. By this point, the Stillwell legacy had transcended the physical realm entirely. It was no longer about who was taken or how. It was about who was allowed to remember. And those who questioned too closely, who tried to map patterns, track missing persons, expose inconsistencies, often vanished from digital spaces first, their accounts deleted, their contributions scrubbed, their names replaced by silence. The old ledger had gone global, now written in code, data, and social memory. The world had become one giant smokehouse, each citizen a potential entry, and every system, from law enforcement to education to healthcare, a potential tool of the same hidden agenda. And the truly chilling truth? Most would never notice, most would never care, because they had been trained to look away, to laugh at the legends, and to accept absence as natural. In the 2010s and beyond, the machinery of disappearance reached its most refined and insidious form yet, a synthesis of technology, psychology, and social control. Surveillance capitalism, the collection of every digital footprint, location, and transaction, became the modern ledger, a detailed map of human behavior, preferences, and vulnerabilities. Every click, every purchase, every interaction added to a data set that could be used to predict, manipulate, or erase lives in ways the Stillwell brothers could never have imagined. Social media algorithms curated perception, reinforcing obedience, distracting curiosity, and shaping memory itself. Dissenters, whistleblowers, and those who asked too many questions found themselves digitally isolated, accounts deleted, posts suppressed, reputations quietly erased. Meanwhile, physical institutions, prisons, foster systems, psychiatric facilities remained active partners in this network of erasure, sometimes feeding data to algorithms that decided who could vanish next, who would be reassigned, and who would simply disappear from sight. The haunted orphanages of folklore were now metaphorical and literal simultaneously, digital, institutional, cultural, psychological. Fear became self-perpetuating. Citizens learned to police themselves, to stay within the bounds of acceptable thought and action, to fear not only the unseen hand but the algorithmic gaze. Identity itself became a ledger entry, a number, a profile that could vanish at a keystroke. Entire communities of people, activists, marginalized populations, whistleblowers, could be erased from public discourse without leaving a trace, their absence treated as accident, error, or coincidence. And the most terrifying lesson inherited from the Stillwell brothers: vanishing no longer required violence, knives, or cellars. It only required the creation of a system so intricate that reality could be rewritten while the masses slept, distracted by stories, myths, and illusions. The power of this system is psychological, not just physical. It forces compliance, breeds fear, and ensures obedience without the need for force. And in this way, the dark lineage of the Stillwells is alive today, hiding in plain sight, written in code, culture, and memory. Every deletion, every disappearance, every manipulated record is a continuation of their work, an invisible empire built on absence, To truly understand the machinery, you must see the pattern not only in the ledger or the disappearances, but in human behavior itself. The Stillwell method, crude as it began in Missouri, relied on three immutable principles: isolation, fear, and ritualized obedience. These principles are replicated in every institutional system that followed. Isolation ensures that the individual cannot rely on witnesses or allies, that their absence is unnoticed until it is too late. Fear conditions compliance, teaching the population to self-censor, to internalize rules, to accept disappearances as normal, even inevitable. Ritualized obedience transforms repetition into habit, turning ordinary actions into mechanisms that maintain control without constant oversight. Consider modern society. The digital ledger tracks behavior, rewarding conformity and punishing deviation. Algorithms serve as invisible overseers, deciding which voices are amplified and which vanish, subtly teaching obedience. Schools, workplaces, bureaucracies, and even entertainment channels all reinforce patterns of compliance. Show up, follow rules, do not question, do not probe. These are modern analogs of the Stillwell's hospitality, at first comfort, then subtle control, and finally the erasure of those who step outside prescribed bounds. The psychological pattern is remarkably consistent. First, you trust the institution. Second, you depend on it. Third, your independence is stripped away. Fourth, absence becomes normalized. The ledger, whether a notebook beneath a floorboard or a digital database, records the transaction. Names, values, disappearances, all hidden under a veneer of normalcy. And like the Ozarks travelers, society rarely questions the hand that offers the water or the meal. Ritual is crucial, from the meals served to children, to the daily routines in prisons, to the rhythm of online interaction. Yes, humans are trained to comply without seeing the cage forming around them. Fear becomes invisible, a whisper rather than a shout, a story rather than a fact, yet it is no less powerful. And this is why, even today, the ghosts of the Stillwell's methods haunt us, because the machinery does not merely remove bodies, it reshapes minds, teaches obedience, and conceals absence behind comfort, routine, and ritual. Every time you laugh at a legend, every time you scroll past a story, every time you trust an institution unquestioningly, you participate in the pattern that began in the Missouri woods in 1867. The ledger grows, the shadows lengthen, and the machinery hums on. Now, listen closely, because this is not a story to passively consume. It is a call to awareness, a ritual of recognition, and a test of your own perception. The shadows that began in the Missouri Ozarks still stretch over every institution, every screen, every system you rely upon, and the first step in breaking free from their control is to mark yourself as awake, to consciously acknowledge the ledger, the machinery, the vanishings, hidden in plain sight. I want you to participate. This is a symbolic act, a lock-in of your own awareness. In the comments below, write this phrase twice. I see the ledger. Do it slowly, deliberately. Let the weight of the words sink into your mind. Say it once, and feel the recognition awaken something deep inside. The understanding that you are no longer passive, that you see what others refuse to see. Say it a second time, and imagine that phrase becoming a shield, a marker in the machinery that separates the observer from the observed, the aware from the oblivious. This simple repetition is more than ritual. It is a commitment. It signals to yourself, and in a strange way to the digital world, that you refuse to vanish silently into the ledger. By participating, you disrupt the pattern, however slightly, and anchor your awareness in the reality that the world's systems, historical, institutional, digital, have been quietly designed to erase the unprepared. Do not underestimate the significance of this act. Even the smallest acknowledgement can fracture the illusion, can illuminate a shadow that has lasted centuries. Those who fail to mark themselves remain vulnerable to the rhythms of compliance, the hidden forces that erase names, histories, and memories. But by seeing, by writing, by declaring, you begin the process of reclaiming agency, of stepping outside the cycle of disappearance that has been perfected for generations. This is you, a first conscious step into the larger truth, the deeper descent into forbidden knowledge, the realization that the ledger is everywhere and it does not discriminate, but your awareness, your engagement can set you apart. Write it, repeat it, internalize it. I see the ledger, I see the ledger. This is not just a phrase, it is an awakening. With your awareness now anchored, it is time to trace the threads that connect the Stillwell brothers' cellar in 1867 to the sprawling architecture of modern control. The pattern is unmistakable. Isolation, ledger-keeping, observation, ritualized obedience, repeated across centuries and institutions. Orphanages, asylums, prisons, and hospitals of the 19th century were merely the first laboratories of methodical disappearance. These small, localized systems taught efficiency and control. Who could be hidden, how property could be cataloged, how absence could be normalized. Fast forward to today, and the same patterns manifest in surveillance states, digital monitoring, and bureaucratic invisibility. Government agencies watch, analyze, and often manipulate behavior, just as the Stillwells cataloged possessions and movements. Corporations monitor consumption and communication, subtly shaping choices and even suppressing inconvenient truths. Education systems, healthcare networks, and financial institutions all participate, knowingly or unknowingly, in a vast ledger of compliance. The principle remains identical: maintain a veneer of legitimacy, offer comfort or utility, and hide the machinery in plain sight. Every controlled interaction, an online recommendation, a routine check-in, a standardized form, is a modern analog of the water offered at the Stillwell cabin. And behind it all, the ledger grows. In the past, it was physical: boots, watches, coins, names inscribed on paper beneath floorboards. Today, it is digital: data points, metadata, algorithms, encrypted files. The human psyche, the most vulnerable ledger of all, is trained to obey, to normalize absence, to forget that someone, somewhere, has disappeared. And just as the first travelers believed in the hospitality of the Stillwells, so too do modern citizens trust systems that have been quietly perfecting the same methods for over 150 years. Patterns repeat, history echoes, and the machinery thrives because the majority remain unaware, distracted by convenience, entertainment, or comfort. But the shadows are not mistakes. They are deliberate, refined, and patient. The ledger is not merely a record. It is a tool, a weapon, a framework for shaping reality itself. And understanding that connection, the leap from a cabin in the Ozarks to a global network of observation, disappearance, and control, is the point where knowledge becomes power, and power becomes responsibility. The machinery's power lies not in violence alone, but in its mastery of the human mind. Fear, the oldest tool of control, is amplified and refined, transforming ordinary compliance into instinctive obedience. Humans are conditioned to see patterns, to trust authority, to seek safety in ritual. The Stillwell brothers understood this on a primitive level. Travelers felt secure because water and rest were offered. Never suspecting danger lay hidden beneath the surface. Modern systems have perfected the principle: surveillance, social expectation, digital validation, each a layer reinforcing the invisible cage. Fear no longer shouts. It whispers. It manifests as social pressure, algorithmic nudges, bureaucratic hurdles, and cultural narratives that reward conformity and punish curiosity. Absence itself becomes a tool. Names vanish from databases, stories disappear from archives, questions are dismissed as paranoid or misinformed, and because society trusts the system, no one notices the erasure. Even dissent is managed carefully. Small concessions of rebellion create the illusion of freedom while reinforcing the perception of omnipotent control. The machinery works by exploiting attention and memory. When people forget, ignore, or rationalize absence, the ledger expands unnoticed. The pattern repeats across institutions. Schools teach obedience, workplaces enforce compliance, social media curates reality, governments hide inconvenient truths behind layers of bureaucracy, fear, isolation, and ritual. These psychological mechanisms are the hidden architecture of disappearance. And the brilliance, if it can be called that, is subtlety. No one notices the cage until they attempt to leave. By then, the ledger has mapped their behavior, predicted their choices, and controlled the narrative surrounding their identity. Awareness, therefore, is both the shield and the weapon. Recognizing these mechanisms, seeing the pattern of disappearance and obedience, is the step that disrupts the cycle. To look away is to participate. To see is to reclaim agency. The machinery is relentless, patient, and adaptive. But the human mind, once awakened to its methods, becomes capable of resistance, capable of noticing absence, capable of questioning the ledger itself. And in that recognition lies a dangerous, empowering truth. The same system that seeks to erase you can only succeed if you consent to be blind. The ledger is alive in every modern institution, often hidden behind the guise of legitimacy, efficiency, or public service. Consider foster care systems, orphanages, and psychiatric institutions, places ostensibly meant to protect, nurture, and rehabilitate. But where records vanish, children are unaccounted for, and the truly vulnerable slip through cracks that no one notices until it is too late. Missing persons reports accumulate, but so many cases are quietly closed, left unresolved, or misfiled. Prisons, too, act as extensions of the ledger. Individuals disappear behind walls, sometimes for decades, their names reduced to numbers, their identities catalogued but erased from public consciousness. Even the healthcare system participates, quietly hiding inconvenient deaths under bureaucratic classifications, mislabeling cause, misdirecting responsibility. The ledger is everywhere, often invisible, yet it shapes society with chilling precision. And then there are the more public mechanisms: mass surveillance, credit systems, digital tracking. Every movement, every transaction, every interaction is recorded, categorized, and analyzed. Individuals who step outside expected patterns can find themselves flagged, excluded, or quietly suppressed, much as travelers who deviated from the Stillwell cabin path might have been recorded in Elias's ledger. And the key to the ledger's power is normalization. When absences are explained away, rationalized, or ignored, the system grows stronger, more precise, and more difficult to resist. Ordinary citizens become unwitting enablers, unconsciously maintaining the infrastructure of erasure through compliance, distraction, or disbelief. History itself becomes malleable. Narratives are curated, inconvenient truths vanish, and collective memory bends to accommodate the ledger's design. Patterns repeat endlessly, disappearances masked as transfers, deaths misclassified, histories rewritten. And yet, every anomaly, every gap, every unacknowledged absence is a mark, a trace of the machinery at work. To understand the ledger is to see these traces, to recognize the system not as chaos, but as deliberate, methodical, and ongoing. It is a realization both terrifying and empowering. The same infrastructure that conceals can be revealed, the same ledger that erases can be traced, and the same patterns that control can be resisted, if one is willing to look, to record, and to remember. The machinery of disappearance is reinforced not only by institutions, but by culture itself. Stories, myths, legends, they all serve as camouflage, distracting attention while encoding obedience and fear into the collective psyche. Haunted orphanages, missing travelers, and the cursed woods of folklore are more than tales. They are rehearsals of the ledger, teaching generations to accept absence and fear as natural. Modern media continues this ritual. Reality television, social media challenges, horror films, even viral news cycles all train attention, dictate what is seen and unseen, and normalize distractions that obscure systemic patterns. Psychological conditioning works hand in hand with these narratives. Repetition is key. Observe, internalize, obey. Algorithms, carefully tuned, amplify voices that conform and suppress those that question. Digital rituals, likes, shares, notifications, act as modern-day tokens, rewarding compliance and conditioning dependence. Absence becomes invisible, embedded in expectation. Names deleted, posts erased, inconvenient truths buried under layers of information, all echo the ledger in the Stillwell's cellar. Even community interactions participate. Gossip, rumor, social judgment, all reinforce attention where it serves the machinery and ignore what threatens it. And the truly brilliant aspect is subtlety. The system need not strike overtly, it need only create the illusion of normality while erasure operates in plain sight. Individuals who notice, who question, become anomalies, flagged not necessarily with violence but with subtle exclusion, ridicule, or social invisibility. Fear, ritual, and isolation, the same tools wielded by Elias and Jeremiah, are replicated on a global scale, invisibly mapping and controlling behavior. Culture teaches compliance and forgetfulness, turning citizens into both participants and victims of the ledge. Every interaction, every story absorbed, every distraction indulged, is another tick in the machinery. And yet, understanding the ritual is the first step toward reclaiming agency. By seeing the hidden patterns in media, culture, and digital spaces, one can begin to separate the signal from the noise, to recognize absence, and to resist the normalization of vanishing. The ledger is vast, persistent, and patient, but every act of conscious observation, every questioning mind, every refusal to accept invisibility becomes a fracture in its architecture, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed machinery is not invulnerable. Resistance begins with memory, the conscious act of seeing and remembering what the ledger seeks to erase. Every missing name, every overlooked disappearance, every erased truth becomes a node in the machinery, silently reinforcing obedience and invisibility. But when an individual chooses to remember, to document, to speak, the ledger begins to fracture. The act is deceptively simple: awareness, acknowledgement, and recording. Journals, digital archives, testimony, even whispered stories, all serve as counterweights to erasure. Consider the travelers of the Ozarks, the few who noticed inconsistencies, who remembered faces, who questioned the Stillwell hospitality, became the first threads connecting disparate disappearances. In modern society, these threads take new forms: investigative journalism, open-source databases, whistleblowers, digital activism. Each effort, though small in isolation, accumulates into a network of resistance. The ledger cannot erase what is collectively witnessed and preserved. Psychological resistance is equally vital. Recognizing manipulation, decoding fear, questioning ritualized obedience, these are acts of survival and defiance. Fear loses its dominion when one sees its design, when one recognizes that ritual and isolation are tools, not inevitabilities. And yet, resistance is never comfortable. The ledger's power thrives on discomfort, uncertainty, and doubt. Questioning can isolate the observer, make them appear eccentric, paranoid, or extreme. But this is precisely the trap. The machinery depends on silence and self-doubt. Every voice that refuses to comply weakens its architecture. Memory, then, is not passive. It is an act of warfare. By remembering the names, the dates, the patterns, one creates a living ledger in opposition, an archive of truth the machinery cannot erase. And in this, the connection to the Stillwell brothers becomes painfully clear. Their victims disappeared physically, but the ledger of memory, testimony, and recognition persists. In the modern world, disappearance has evolved, but resistance has evolved with it. To remember, to witness, to document, to question, these are acts that protect identity, preserve truth, and reclaim power from systems designed to erase both. In the shadows of history and the glare of contemporary systems, memory is the ultimate defiance. If you have followed this far, you must understand that knowledge alone is not enough. Awareness must translate into action, into the deliberate cultivation of methods to see, record, and resist the ledger. First, observe relentlessly. Notice patterns of absence, manipulation, and erasure in your surroundings, institutions, and media. Track anomalies, cross-reference stories, and question official narratives. Do not accept gaps or inconsistencies as coincidence. Treat them as evidence, not conjecture. Second, document meticulously. Journals, encrypted digital records, photographs, or even symbolic phrases, like the one you wrote earlier, create a personal ledger, a repository of truth that the machinery cannot easily erase. Third, cultivate community. The ledger thrives on isolation. Connection disrupts it. Seek allies who question, who observe, who remember, and share findings in secure, trusted channels. Fourth, challenge ritualized obedience. Recognize where repetition, routine, and habit condition compliance and deliberately disrupt them. Small deviations, conscious refusals to comply unquestioningly, break the rhythm of control. Fifth, protect identity and information. The ledger functions because data is vulnerable. Encrypt communications, separate personal and public personas, and understand how digital systems record and manipulate behavior. Sixth, teach awareness. Every individual you awaken to the ledger multiplies resistance exponentially. Education, conversation, and subtle instruction are acts of preservation. Lastly, embrace fear as a guide, not a cage. Understand it, analyze its origin, and let it sharpen awareness rather than paralyze action. The ledger seeks compliance, silence, and invisibility. Your job is the opposite, to resist, witness, record, and connect. And in doing so, you align yourself with every observer, every chronicler, every whistleblower, who has confronted systems designed to erase. The lesson of the Stillwell brothers is not just horror, it is instruction. From cellar to smokehouse to modern algorithm, the methods persist, but so too does the opportunity to disrupt them. The machinery is patient, but awareness is faster. The ledger is vast, but individual action creates cracks. Each act of observation, each record kept, each ritual consciously broken is a blow against erasure. And once you understand these steps, you no longer move blindly. You navigate the machinery with intent, perception, and the power to survive its erasures. The ledger, once a simple notebook beneath a floorboard in the Missouri Ozarks, has evolved into a complex global system of observation, erasure, and control, but its essence remains unchanged. What began with Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell cataloging travelers and possessions has become a reflection of human institutions, culture, and technology. Disappearance, in its many forms, is not merely physical. It is psychological, social, and digital. History shows us the mechanisms: isolation, fear, ritual, and record-keeping. Psychology reveals how compliance is cultivated, how memory is shaped, how absence is normalized. Technology demonstrates how observation, manipulation, and erasure can occur on a massive scale, invisibly and efficiently. The common thread is control, and the lesson is terrifyingly simple. Systems that erase or manipulate survive because most people fail to see them. But understanding the ledger, recognizing its methods, and taking deliberate action is not just knowledge, it is responsibility. Witnessing, recording, questioning, and teaching are acts of resistance. Memory becomes armor. Awareness becomes power. action becomes defiance. And the most profound truth of all is this: the machinery, regardless of scale or sophistication, can only dominate the mind if it remains unseen. Once illuminated, its mechanisms lose absolute power. The stories of vanished travelers, hidden chambers, and ledgered possessions are not relics of the past. They are templates, warnings, and instruction manuals for recognizing, surviving, and resisting modern systems of control. The burden and the opportunity are yours. To observe is to reclaim agency. To remember is to preserve truth. To act is to fracture the ledger. And in that fracture lies the seed of freedom, the spark of resistance, and the continuation of knowledge that no machinery, no ledger, no shadow can ultimately erase. The Stillwell brothers' story, horrific as it was, now serves a larger purpose: to teach vigilance, illuminate manipulation, and awaken the mind to truths hidden in plain sight for generations. Once you see the ledger, once you understand its patterns, its presence cannot be unseen. Your perception of reality changes permanently. The world you once thought random, innocent, or orderly now reveals hidden structures, invisible currents of control, and the faint traces of disappearances, both historical and modern. Every institution, every system, every routine bears the imprint of the same methods: isolation, fear, ritual, and record-keeping. You notice the gaps, the erased names, the manipulated narratives, the absences normalized as inevitability. This knowledge is dangerous because it is irreversible. To ignore it now would be to return to a state of unawareness, but the mind cannot unsee what it has seen. Every interaction, every story, every institution becomes a lens through which the ledger is visible. The burden is profound, understanding that disappearance is not always physical, that control is often invisible, and that absence can be manufactured, institutionalized, and normalized. But with that burden comes power. Awareness allows you to question, to observe, to preserve memory, to resist subtle coercion, and to act with intention. The ledger no longer dictates your reality unchecked. You exist as a witness, a recorder, and a disruptor. And this is why the story of the Stillwell brothers matters beyond its historical horror. It is a mirror reflecting the systems that still operate, quietly and efficiently, around us. To live fully in awareness is to recognize absence, to remember what has been erased, and to disrupt the machinery whenever possible. The ledger is vast, persistent, and patient, but once illuminated, it loses the absolute control it once wielded. Once seen, you cannot unsee, and the world, forever altered by your awareness, becomes a place where absence is no longer invisible, where control is questioned, and where truth, however suppressed, has a chance to endure. Now, in this final descent, understand the full weight of the ledger. It is not merely a story of the Stillwell brothers, nor only a cautionary tale of vanished travelers. It is a living, evolving system that spans centuries, cultures, and technologies, quietly shaping who is remembered, who is forgotten, and who vanishes without trace. The horror of the Missouri cabin was not just the cellar, the smokehouse, or the ledger beneath the floorboards. It was the principle itself, that human life, memory, and value can be quantified, catalogued, and erased. That same principle thrives today, hidden behind institutions, algorithms, and social rituals, imperceptible to those who do not look. But the story does not end in despair. It ends in awakening. You now carry the knowledge that the ledger exists, that absence can be manufactured, that control can be invisible yet omnipresent. And with this knowledge comes both danger and power. The danger of seeing what others ignore, the power to resist, to observe, to record, and to act. Every ledgered system, digital, institutional, cultural, relies on the unwitting, the passive, the unobservant. By choosing awareness, by remembering, by questioning, you step outside the machinery's grip. The past and the present merge. The terror of travelers disappearing in 1867 echoes in the subtle vanishings, the hidden manipulations, the normalized erasures of today. Your role is clear: witness, preserve, disrupt, teach. Do not underestimate the significance of attention. The ledger thrives on inattention. Every observation, every record, every refusal to comply unquestioningly is an act of resistance. And in this resistance, the pattern of disappearance loses its inevitability, the machinery's control weakens, and the ledger, vast though it may be, is forced to contend with human awareness. Remember the Stillwell brothers, the cellar, the ledger, the smokehouse, the vanished travelers, not as mere horror, but as a lesson. Awareness is the ultimate safeguard. Memory is the weapon. Conscious action is the shield. The ledger, in its many forms, will continue to operate, patient and persistent, but it can no longer operate unchecked in the mind that sees. You have crossed the threshold of understanding. You cannot return unchanged. And that, more than any fear, more than any story of disappearance, is the most powerful truth of all. Knowledge, once awakened, transforms reality itself, and the shadows of the ledger, however vast, must reckon with the observer who refuses to vanish.